Chapter 1. The Last Morning. September 7th, 1900, a Friday, Galveston, Texas. A city of 37,000 people sitting on a thin barrier island in the Gulf of Mexico. Not a town, a real city, the fourth largest port in the United States. Wealthier per capita than almost anywhere else in the country. There were electric streetcars, grand Victorian mansions, a brand new cotton exchange, churches on every other block. People were going to work. Kids were heading to school. The markets were open. It was a normal morning. There were clouds rolling in from the southeast, and the surf had been unusually heavy for 2 days. Some fishermen had noticed the waves were coming from a strange direction. The barometric pressure had been dropping steadily. A few people were uneasy. But the city's chief meteorologist, a man named Isaac Klein, had published an article just 6 years earlier. In it, he argued that a major hurricane striking Galveston directly was not just unlikely, it was essentially impossible. The shape of the Gulf, the angle of the coast, the geography of Texas. He believed it would protect the island from the worst. He was wrong. And within 24 hours, between 6,000 and 12,000 people would be dead. It remains to this day the deadliest natural disaster in American history. Not Katrina. Not the San Francisco earthquake. Not any flood or tornado or wildfire you've ever heard of. This one. September 8th, 1900. Chapter 2. The island that shouldn't have been a city. Before we get into what happened, let me tell you something that I think gets overlooked in most retellings of this story. Galveston was genuinely extraordinary. By 1900, it had the first telephone exchange in Texas, the first electric lights, the first medical college in the state. The Bishop's Palace, still standing today, was one of the most impressive private homes in the American South. But here's the thing that matters for what comes next. Galveston sat on a narrow sand island, barely 8 feet above sea level at its highest point. The Gulf of Mexico was on one side, Galveston Bay on the other. There was no natural barrier, no high ground. The whole island was essentially a sandbar with a city built on top of it. Engineers had warned about this for years. One report from the 1870s flat out said the island needed a seawall, or it was only a matter of time before a major storm wiped everything out. Nothing was built. The money wasn't there, or the political will wasn't there, or people just didn't want to think about it. Sound familiar? The warnings existed. The reports existed. Nobody acted. This is the part of disaster history that never changes, and it's worth sitting with for a second. The pattern. Someone raises an alarm. The alarm is ignored. Catastrophe follows. This isn't just a Galveston story. It keeps happening because the cost of prevention is always visible, and the cost of doing nothing is invisible. Until it isn't. Chapter 3. What was coming. On September 4th, a tropical storm was spotted near Cuba. The U.S. Weather Bureau tracked it moving northwest. Their prediction? It would curve northeast, away from the Gulf Coast. Standard path for these systems, nothing too alarming. But this storm didn't curve. It kept going west, then northwest, straight into the Gulf of Mexico, and directly toward the Texas coast. The Weather Bureau in Washington actually ordered its Galveston office to stop sending independent forecasts. All warnings had to be approved by the central office. So local meteorologists who were watching the storm in real time were essentially cut out of the communication chain. By September 7th, the storm was massive, moving at about 15 miles per hour. Water temperatures in the Gulf were high, warm enough to feed a hurricane and keep it strong all the way to landfall. Isaac Klein, The same man who'd written that Galveston was safe rode his horse along the beach that morning and noticed something that changed his mind completely. The tide was rising fast, much faster than normal. The waves were enormous and coming from the wrong direction. He started going door to door in the beach neighborhoods, telling people to move to higher ground. There was no higher ground. The tallest point on the island was about 8.7 feet above sea level. By early afternoon on September 8th, the streets were already flooding, and the storm hadn't even arrived yet. Chapter 4. The night everything ended. If you want to understand what happened next, forget everything you know about modern hurricanes. There were no satellites in 1900, no Doppler radar, no NOAA aircraft flying into the eye of the storm, no text alerts, no mandatory evacuation orders broadcast across every screen in the city. You found out a hurricane was coming when you could see it with your own eyes. By late afternoon on September 8th, the winds had reached hurricane force. The storm surge, the wall of water pushed ahead of the storm, began moving over the island from the Gulf side. The water didn't rise like a tide. People described it arriving in surges, waves stacking on top of waves until the entire island was submerged. At its peak, the storm surge over Galveston reached somewhere between 15 and 20 feet. The highest point on the island was 8.7 feet. Do the math. There was nowhere to go. Families climbed to the upper floors of their homes, then to the attics, then through the roof. The wind was so strong, estimated at over 145 miles per hour at peak, with gusts higher, that buildings were being torn apart and the debris turned into projectiles. People were killed by flying lumber, by collapsed walls, by being swept off rooftops into water that was churning with wreckage. One survivor, a young woman named Daisy Thorne, later described clinging to a wooden beam for hours in the dark, surrounded by the sounds of people screaming, and then silence. Just water and wind. The storm made landfall that night and raged for hours. By the time it passed, Galveston looked like it had been erased. Chapter 5. What the morning revealed. If you've followed this channel for a while, you know I don't usually spend a lot of time on raw death toll numbers. They can actually make things feel more distant rather than less. But here, the scale matters. Estimates of the dead range from 6,000 to 12,000 people. The lower end is the official figure used at the time. The higher estimates come from later analysis trying to account for people who were simply never found. Out of a city of 37,000, that's somewhere between 1 in 6 and 1 in 3 residents. Let that settle. 1 in 3 people you'd pass on the street on a Friday morning were dead by Saturday. 3,600 homes were destroyed, another 2,000 damaged. The entire south side of the island, the part facing the Gulf, was wiped clean. Blocks of houses, gone. Not damaged, gone. What was left was a debris field that stretched for miles, with the bodies of the dead buried inside it. The stench reached ships offshore. Rescuers who came to help couldn't bring enough coffins. They buried the dead at sea at first, loading bodies onto barges and taking them into the Gulf. Then the bodies began washing back to shore. Eventually, they burned them in massive funeral pyres right there on the island. Isaac Klein, the man who had ridden through the beach neighborhoods warning people the day before, survived. His brother also survived. His wife did not. He spent the rest of his life working in meteorology. He never again claimed any coastline was safe from a major hurricane. And if you're wondering why this isn't better known, why Galveston 1900 doesn't get the same cultural memory as Katrina or the San Francisco earthquake, I think part of it is timing. It happened before widespread photography was common, before radio, before the kind of live documentation that makes disasters feel real to people who weren't there. The images exist, but there aren't many. The voices survive in written accounts, but not on recording. It's a disaster that happened just before the modern age of mass media. And in some ways, that has made it easier to forget. Chapter 6. The City That Refused to Die. Here's what I find genuinely remarkable about this story, and it's the part that most people don't know. Galveston rebuilt. Not just physically. They did something that was, at the time, considered one of the greatest feats of civil engineering in American history. They built a seawall. 17 feet high. 3 miles long initially, eventually extended to over 10 miles. A massive concrete wall along the Gulf side of the island, designed to absorb exactly what had hit them in 1900. And then, and this is the part that stops me every time, they raised the entire grade of the island. The city dredged sand from the bottom of the Gulf and pumped it under every structure on the inland side of the seawall. Over 2,000 buildings were raised, lifted on jack screws while crews pumped sand underneath them. Churches, hotels, the entire neighborhood. They raised the grade of the city by as much as 17 feet in some places. This took years. It cost what would be hundreds of millions of dollars in today's money. And they did it while simultaneously rebuilding everything that had been destroyed. That seawall was tested for the first time in 1915 when a hurricane of similar strength struck Galveston again. The death toll that time, 8 people. 8, compared to potentially 12,000. That's what engineering and preparation actually accomplish. That gap between 12,000 and 8. That's not luck. That's what humans can do when they actually apply the lessons a disaster teaches them. Chapter 7. What Galveston Lost and Never Got Back. There's one more piece to this story that I think matters. Before 1900, Galveston was the dominant city in Texas. It had the money, the port, the infrastructure, the cultural institutions. Houston, sitting 50 miles inland on a bayou that wasn't even navigable at the time, was a smaller, scrappier place. After the storm, the dynamic shifted permanently. Businesses that had survived the hurricane looked at the island and asked themselves an honest question. Do we want to rebuild here knowing this could happen again? Many said no. They moved to Houston. Investment followed. Houston dug a ship channel, connected itself to the Gulf, and took Galveston's place as the commercial heart of Texas. Today, Houston is the 4th largest city in the United States. Galveston has about 50,000 people.
One storm didn't just kill thousands of people.
It redirected the entire future of a region. This is something I think about whenever I look at how catastrophes reshape geography. The disaster doesn't end when the storm moves on. The disaster ends, if it ends, years or decades later, in decisions made by people who never experienced the original event, but are living in the world it created. Galveston is still there, still beautiful in its way. The Victorian architecture that survived, the seawall, the history pressed into every block of the old downtown. But it never became what it was going to be. The storm stole that future. Chapter 8. The Lesson That Keeps Getting Ignored. I want to leave you with something that I think is worth sitting with. Every major infrastructure failure in American history follows the same pattern. Engineers raise alarms. Reports are written. The cost of prevention is weighed against the cost of doing nothing. And doing nothing wins, because nothing has happened yet, and it's easy to discount a risk that hasn't materialized. Until it does. Galveston 1900 was that moment for coastal Texas. Katrina 2005 was that moment, again, for New Orleans. despite Galveston having already shown everyone exactly what an unprotected coastal city looks like when a major hurricane arrives. The seawall they built after 1900 worked. It saved Galveston from near-certain destruction in 1915. The lesson was right there. And 105 years later, a different American city paid the price for not learning it. I don't say that to be grim. I say it because the story of Galveston 1900 isn't just history. It's a blueprint for what goes wrong when warnings are ignored, and for what's possible when people decide to actually act on them. The seawall exists. The raised grade exists. 8 people died in 1915 instead of 12,000. We know how to do this right. We've known for over a century. That's the part of the Galveston story that deserves to be remembered most. Chapter 9. One more thing before you go. This video took a long time to put together. The research, the sources, trying to get the details right rather than just telling a story that sounds good. If you found it worth your time, a like genuinely helps other people find it. And if you've got a question, a correction, or something about this story that hit you differently than you expected, drop it in the comments. I read them, and that kind of conversation is honestly what makes doing this worthwhile. The history here is deep. Galveston 1900 has enough in it for several more videos. The political aftermath, the full engineering story of the seawall, individual survival accounts that are remarkable. If there's a specific angle you want me to dig into, let me know down there. Stay curious, and take care of yourselves.